I'm not surprised, motherfuckers.
Surprise, surprise, motherfucker! The king is back! You wanna fight with boss? I wanna fight with real gangster.
Det er onsdag den 10. juni 2020. Velkommen til endnu en episode af MMA uden filter. Mit navn er Ehsan Faizzad. Jeg er journalist med kampsport som speciale og din vært på verdens hurtigst voksende magasin. Det er sommer, mine damer og herrer. Jeg er i godt humør. I kommer til at være i godt humør, fordi MMA uden filter leverer endnu en episode i den her uge. En ekstra en af slagsen. Og hvorfor det? Ja, fordi vi er i en periode lige i øjeblikket, hvor flere store UFC-stjerner er utilfredse med verdens største MMA-organisation, UFC. Vi snakker om en Jorge Masvidal, John Jones, som blandt andet er utilfredse over deres lønninger. Og så har vi en Henry Cejudo og den største af slagsen, Conor McGregor, som er gået på pension meget, meget tidligt. Men hvad er egentlig op og ned? Hvor meget tjener en UFC-fighter egentlig? Og passer det, når Conor McGregor i optakten til kampen mod Khabib Nurmagomedov sagde, at han tjener $50 millioner? Det skal vi snakke om lige om et øjeblik med en mand, der ved rigtig meget om det her. Men allerførst, husk at like og subscribe på YouTube. Det er din billet. Jeg mener det, når jeg siger det. Det vil betyde rigtig, rigtig meget. Ellers så gerne giv os en bedømmelse på alle podcast-platformene, hvis I lytter der. Og ellers så bare spred ordet til jeres venner, fjender, familie og hvad det nu ellers er. Når det så er sagt, lad os gå i gang til det i virkeligheden handler om. My guest is a man who knows a lot about MMA and finances. He has covered the sport for the last 10 years, primarily for Bloody Elbow. You know him probably on Twitter as Hey Not The Face, but his real name is John Nash. John, welcome, buddy. How are you?
Hvor hilset.
Thank you. Can you just elaborate on that? Why Hey Not The Face on Twitter? What is that all about?
It was a joke. It's an in joke basically about my fighting prowess. You know, it's taken from The Simpsons when Mo Sislak was getting in a fight and he's like, "Hey, not the face." So
that is what the picture is all about as well.
Well, yeah, that's my dad giving me the back of the hand. Yes, he did it as a joke, and I thought it was funny.
Okay, so it's not a real thing.
It's not a real, yeah. Even though he could do that, he was a very big man growing up, but no, he would. He's a kind guy. He wouldn't.
I gotta say, John, I was as excited. I'm as excited to do this interview as I was watching your face, because I didn't know how you look like. Why aren't there any pictures of you on social media and stuff?
I think there is. There's a few.
Is it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've gained a little weight the last 2 years, so it might not look the same as I did a couple of years ago, but might be it. That's otherwise. But I don't do much in front of the camera. I do a podcast, Show Money, where I'm in front of the camera, but most of the time I'm rarely on video.
Great, and I hear you're a great fan of Denmark, right? You want to move over here?
I dislike immensely all the Nordic countries because they make me feel so inferior about how we do things in America. You guys have to rub it in, like the quality of your life and your education system and your health care and your welfare system and your use of your mass unionization rates and all that stuff, all that crap that gives you a great quality of life. I don't need to hear about it.
You don't need it over there.
No, we don't. We like wallowing in crud. That's the way we do it in America. Just no. I'm a big fan of the Nordic model because I don't know if I'm sure you know some American history, but the New Deal era of America, I'm a big fan of that era of America, and I think that the Nordic model shares a lot of similarities, and I would like to see that are returning and try to reincorporate a lot of that stuff. So yeah.
Well, you're always welcome here, John. I know you don't want to come here, but you're always welcome. But let's get down to what this is really about, John. We have a situation right now where you have a few big UFC stars being unhappy with either their fighter pay, which is in John Jones's case, and Jorge Masvidal, or you have a couple of big stars like Henry Cejudo and Conor McGregor retiring from the sport because of maybe negotiations with the UFC and them being frustrated. Can you just start with that? I mean, what is going on right now? What is this all about?
I mean, it's I guess it's been for years. There's always been fighters have always been unhappy with their pay, but this is This feels a little different because you have some of the biggest names speaking publicly about it, and usually they don't speak publicly. They're all speaking at the same time, taking different action. And they're also speaking from a point of view of knowledge. Before, guys would just say, you know, they would say in generalities they don't feel like they're getting paid enough. But you can tell the impact, I guess, of the antitrust lawsuit, because we're getting numbers from the UFC, accurate, exact numbers of what people get paid and what the percentages are, the split. And you can see that the fighters are reciting those numbers. They're claiming that, you know, they're saying like the UFC fighters only make 18%. Well, that comes directly from the evidence, the exhibits in the lawsuit. And so that's interesting. I mean, I'm surprised because some of this has been kind of, the knowledge was available if you look for it for years, but it wasn't concrete. And I guess I'm a little surprised, I guess, how important getting the information directly from the UFC, unsealed documents showing it, how important that, I guess, is for fighters, that they know for sure that this is true, that the UFC is making this much money and they're only paying this much to the fighters. So
what we know, like, if I ask you, what do we know from about how much the UFC fighters are being paid today? You're saying that that's 18% or something like that?
It fluctuates. We know for fact what they made as a total and what the highest paid person made up until about 2017. So we know that, we have a fact. We don't have the individual names, but we can kind of figure out.
What was that?
Well, the highest paid fighter up until 2017, we know was $8 million, the most a fighter ever made. And from several sources, I'm pretty confident that was Brock Lesnar for UFC 200. So that's the most a fighter ever made. So when people were talking about Conor McGregor, when he was fighting Nate Diaz or Eddie Alvarez making $10-20 million for those fights, that's not true, because those numbers don't show up in the total, what the UFC was paying. We also know that, like, what the highest paid fighter every year for several years was, the highest paid in like 2014 made $1.85 million total that year. So we don't know if it was one or two fights they did it in, but that was the highest paid fighters. We have all this information. So we know that. After 2017 gets a little more murky, but we know what their projections were, what they were projecting they would pay, and they projected themselves that they would pay under 20% going forward. We also know the New York Post reported that they apparently got a hold of some document from the UFC that total fighter pay last year was about under 150 million, which would be about 16%. So so everything kind of supports each other, that, you know, everything reinforces the previous assumption we had with more evidence that this was accurate.
So the 18% you were talking about, that's from the lawsuit, right?
That's from the lawsuit.
And what year is that from?
That is, well, you got to think, the total fighter pay actually under the lawsuit during the last couple of years, 14, 15, 16, and then what they projected they would pay in 17 and 18 was about 19 or 20% per year. But that included stuff that we normally wouldn't count as fighter pay. That included stuff like the Reebok payments, which, you know, I guess you could consider, but some people didn't because that replaced previous sponsorship. That included the USADA drug testing. That includes stuff like that that's not direct purses, other sources of income or stuff. Even the USADA testing, most people I know don't consider that pay. That's something the fighters are required to do, but that's included in the compensation. If you deduct that non-fight pay out of it, it comes out to 18%, and that's from the lawsuit. And it fluctuates every year, but generally that's the average from like 2000. I can't remember exactly, but from about 2012 to 2016, that was the average every year.
Okay, so how possible is it? Because sometimes you hear people saying, well, that's old numbers. Like we have a different time now. It's 2020. The number can be different today. Is that possible that it could be that different from 18%?
It could, but there's a couple things that make you think that it's not. One is they projected ahead of time what it would be. Two is if you look at the rest of their finances, first, we know what their costs were back then, how much it cost to put on an event without fighter pay, excluding fighter pay, all the other costs. We have their costs, their expenses for 2012 through 2015. We also know how much they were expecting to cut costs. And then we also know what their EBITDA is now. We can calculate what their EBITDA was last year, for example. Last year, they made about $850 million in total revenue, according to Moody's, and their EBITDA was about $350 million. Well, that lines up pretty much exactly with the previous expenses and the cost savings. if their fighter pays between 16 and 20%. So in other words, yeah, the pay can fluctuate, but it can't fluctuate so wildly because otherwise you wouldn't see those type of earnings that we're seeing now.
How does the UFC fighter pay align with what the fighters are saying themselves? Because I hear Daniel Cormier say, like, you guys have no idea how much we're making. He's saying that they're probably making a lot more than what we think. Does he have a case there or no?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. A lot of fighters make a lot more than we think. What's reported on fight night is often not the full purse. There's what's called a letter of agreement, a side letter, which is an additional contract that pays without reporting to the commission. So some fighters can make 500,000, a million, even 2 million on the side without us knowing.
So you're not talking about the extra pay-per-view money. You're saying like the base pay, the show and win money, they can actually have like maybe twice that in show and win money as well, and we're not knowing that.
This is guaranteed money. So this is guaranteed money that they can have on the side. And in a weird way, this was a part of the side. We had a reveal about this with Conor McGregor. Remember when he fought Nate Diaz the first time, he had $1 million guaranteed contract. And then he fought a second time and he had $3 million to show. But his attorney, speaking to the Nevada Athletic Commission, basically informed us that $2 million was already, he was getting paid that before, but he wanted it made public because he didn't like the idea of Nate Diaz, I think, making more than him publicly. So that's a side letter agreement. That's kind of example what it is. He had a $2 million that was being unreported that later was reported because he wanted it reported. But that's the type of deals those are. Okay.
But with Conor McGregor, he often says he talks about how much he makes. He's actually kind of different compared to the other fighters who don't talk about their fighter pay as much. But he also said leading up to the Khabib fight, he threw out a crazy number saying that he could probably earn around $50 million for that fight. Is that even possible in MMA?
I mean, who knows for sure, because I don't have access to the actual that year's numbers, but it doesn't add up because we know there's previous times that he talked about making, like I was going to make 10 million versus Nate Diaz the first fight. Second fight is like, I can make 20 million, I think he said. And then, then by the time he fought Eddie Alvarez, he said he made over 40 million for the year fighting. Well, we have the records now and we know that's not possible. 8 million was the most anybody ever made that year. I mean, up to that point in a fight that the UFC was projecting with higher pay-per-view numbers than they actually ended up. They were projecting that his first two Diaz fights, he'd make 15 million. So we know that from the court documents. So his numbers were grossly inflated before that what he was claiming. And then if you look at the 50 million number, it doesn't quite add up because the amount of revenue they made in 2016 was 690 million. They made 695 million in 2018, the year that the Khabib fight took place. The EBITDA earnings in 2016 was 226 million. It was about 240 million in 2018. So we got 15 million more EBITDA. If they were paying Conor so much above the norm of what they would pay other fighters, then you got to ask, where did that extra earnings come from? That's the part that makes me, it's like, it doesn't, cost savings could explain some of it, but it doesn't fully add up. The numbers don't really add up.
So you're saying it's highly unlikely because he wants to project that to the public that he's earning a lot of money.
It's his gimmick. It's part of his sales pitch. He's like Money Mayweather. When Mayweather made the shift from being Pretty Boy Floyd Mayweather into Money Mayweather, I think Conor's the same thing. Him being this guy that makes more than everybody else is a big part of his marketing brand.
Do we know how much he made for the Khabib fight then?
We don't. I mean, if I had to take a guess, I mean, I don't even want. I'd put the ball. If you look at what the UFC typically pays, and maybe he made more in this, maybe there's other deals, but typically for something like the amount that they were reporting, it'd be probably in the $20 million range.
Okay.
Because even though they never pay that much, but based on the percentage they pay for other fights, you make it bigger because they sold a lot more. 20 million seems like what a typical UFC fighter would have made in a situation like that, like a GSP or Anderson Silva.
How about discretionary bonuses? Because we hear that argument very often as well. Well, sometimes Dana White, he gives like bonuses to some fighters, maybe company men or like exciting fighters. Is that a real thing? And how frequent are they and how big are they as well?
Well, it's a real thing, and every fighter basically gets one. Usually you get a check for like $2,000 after an event that comes a week after your drug test clears. And that's your discretionary bonus. UFC doesn't have to pay you, but they give you a couple extra thousand that, covers the expense of the drug, the testing and the licensing. Occasionally though, they'll give you bigger bonuses, and it can run up to, $1 million or whatever. I mean, we know from the filing that McGregor got a 2.11 million discretionary bonus for UFC 189. That's the biggest one I've ever heard of. But we also know big bonuses are not very common, these discretionary bonuses. That occasionally people get it. And I think people assume because a few fighters get it that every fighter gets these big bonuses. But we know, because you can break down how the UFC's budget is and what they're spending and what their fighter pay per year is, that it can't possibly be that large, that big of a part of the budget. So yeah, some fighters are getting these discretionary bonuses, but it's not every fighter, and it's not massive amounts. I mean, Gray Maynard just recently talked about his 2 title fights against Frankie Edgar at UFC 125 and 136. He got a discretionary bonus for both those, $100,000. So he got his show and win pay for the first fight, $26,000 plus $100,000 plus fight of the night. So he made about $200,000 that night. And the second time, he only got his show money, $42,000, and $100,000 discretionary bonus for being in a title fight. So that's more the typical discretionary bonus.
So is it only the big stars who are getting that, or is it also like new guys, up and comers, and maybe even guys who had their first or second fight?
Well, occasionally they'll give them to new guys, but the performance of the night bonus usually replaces the discretionary bonus for a lot of guys. If you have a good fight, they give you the bonus of the fight of the night, the performance of the night, $50,000. So they don't give you a bonus usually if you win that. But yeah, new guy, like I said, everybody generally, unless you've made them upset, they don't want to give you a bonus. There's a few fighters that don't get that, but get about a $2,000 check per event. If they really like you and they thought you did a good job, they might give you a $5,000 check. If you're appearing in an important fight and your contract's low, like if you're the main event of a TV fight, they might give you a $25,000 bonus.
So let's talk about one of those new guys. We have a Danish fighter, the Olympian Mark O. Madsen. I saw his deal, like what was reported through the Athletic Commission. $33K to show, $33K to win. Is that a good contract for only your second UFC fight?
Yeah, that's above average. I mean, because usually the UFC have to do it in tiers. So he's on actually what would be probably your third contract in the UFC.
Wow,
it's way above the average. I mean, so I'm not saying it's a great deal because he's not making a ton of money fighting. But it's way above what most fighters come in, they get $10,000 to show, $10,000 to win. They finish that contract, their next contract. I can't remember the tier system right now, but I think it's $22,000 or $24,000 to show, $24,000 to win. And then you finish that out, and on your third contract, it's in the 30,000s, where Mark Madsen's is right now.
So can you elaborate, like, how are MMA fighters compensated in comparison to athletes from other sports leagues like the NFL, the NBA, and whatnot?
Well, I mean, compared to the major league sports, they're paid terribly because those are unionized sports. That in America we often have what's called because of the collective bargaining agreements, we often have a wage split with the players. So the league, whatever the league makes, 50% of it goes to the players. And then it's divided up by, a bunch of collective bargaining rules and contracts. And your guys' your football leagues out in Europe, because there's so much competition, a lot of the players make a lot of money, a lot. And there's so much competition too, that even the guys further down make pretty good money. So in that case, it's very different in MMA. A few guys make good money, but a lot of guys, if you're not in the UFC, you don't make anything. If you're not in the UFC, you basically make all the money being made in MMA is only in the UFC. And in the UFC, it's I mean, it's better than the rest of what everybody else is making, but I think for a lot of people, it's not what they consider, pro sports athlete wages for most people. You're talking on average, I think the median, I'm not 100% accurate on this because I have to go look it up again, but I think the median purse for a UFC fighter is around 40 or 50,000 when they fight, which, it's for US dollars, which is, if you fight twice a year, that's 100,000. So that sounds like a lot, but then you got to remember that's gross, not net. You've got to pay all your expenses. So that goes down to 60,000 right then. So you made 60,000 as a pro fighter. And on top of that, it might've taken you 10 years of basically making no money to get there. And then that money's got to last the rest of your career. Because what kind of job can you do based on the skill of professional fighting afterwards? It's not job training for your next career. It's not going to lead to anything better. So
let's move over to the ESPN deal with UFC. Can you tell us a little bit about how it's structured, the pay-per-view system, and also about, we also hear that they have like a guaranteed payment from ESPN. How much is that? Do you know anything about that?
I've heard from people what it's supposedly the deal. I haven't confirmed this yet. But I've heard the way it's been described to me from several sources is that it pays a basic rate, guaranteed rate per event, $15 million about per pay-per-view. That's the minimum they'll pay. And then when the UFC crosses and then at that, ESPN gets to keep every pay-per-view sale then up to the threshold. After the threshold, there's a split, and I'm not sure this. I've heard different things in the split. That the splits, it favors the UFC 60-40 or it's 50-50. I mean, it's
what is it? What is the threshold? Do you know that?
Threshold supposedly, again, I haven't confirmed this, but this is from different sources, is about 260,000 pay-per-view buys. So the first 260,000 all go to ESPN, and then at that point the UFC splits it. But the UFC is guaranteed 15 million now per pay-per-view. So which is even better than if it sold 260,000 of the old system. So it's a great deal for the UFC because even though overall pay-per-view sales are probably down, they now have consistent pay on their pay-per-views that they don't have to worry about fluctuating having a bad pay-per-view.
So can you actually say that the big MMA and UFC stars are actually less than important now than they were before the ESPN deal?
Oh yeah, I mean it's the big stars still add on to that, but they have less leverage because the UFC is less dependent on them. No matter what, if the UFC is long, my understanding is that the quality control is that the UFC guarantees there'll be a title fight on those pay-per-views. So as long as the UFC can put a title fight on a pay-per-view, they're guaranteed money. They're guaranteed a money-making pay-per-view. So if you're a John Jones saying, I won't fight unless you pay me more, they can say, well, we don't care. We're still going to make money on any fight we put on. So you can sit out as long as you want.
So is it fair, because you often hear the argument, well, I heard an argument recently saying, well, John Jones and Conor McGregor have a case here, but maybe like a Kamaru Usman, Henry Cejudo, they don't have an argument because they don't sell pay-per-views. Is it fair to only judge a fighter's worth by looking at how many pay-per-views they can draw and sell?
Yeah, I actually don't think it's 100% fair because there's a couple things to put into it. Like one is like a lot of fighters individually on TV, ESPN don't change the ratings, but collectively, if you put up all the fighters together, that's why people are watching the UFC. In other words, people watch UFC because they know that the best fighters in the world are the UFC. If all the UFC fighters went somewhere else and you just filled it up with nobodies off the street, would people tune in? Maybe at first, just because it'd be a curiosity factor, but after a month or two, ratings would plummet. So individually, the UFC fighters might not have drawing power, but collectively, knowing that's where all the best fighters are, that's why ESPN, that's why people tune into ESPN, and that's why they get a big TV deal. With the other fighters, yes, John Jones and Conor McGregor sell a ton and probably are way underpaid based on that. But even a guy like Usman and stuff, by just being the number one fighter, the title alone is what kind of draws people to watch the event. The fact that he owns the title and is the best fighter in the world should have some sort of cachet, some sort of leverage that lets him profit off that. You're tuning in. You might not be tuning in specifically to watch Usman, but you're tuning in to watch who is the best welterweight in the world fight. And since he is currently the best welterweight in the world owning the title, that's the person you're tuning in to watch. So yeah, you could say that certain fighters don't specifically draw, but they're a key component of why people are tuning in.
Do you see a union in the near future in MMA, maybe as a consequence of what we're seeing right now with the big stars being unhappy with the UFC?
I mean, I guess I'm a little pessimistic on that. One is because right now the fighters are classified as independent contractors, which means they can't even form a union. Two is the Trump administration, the current administration is, it's NLRB, it's Labor Board, National Labor Review Board, is pretty hostile to organized labor. So they're not going to do anything to assist fighters to make a union. So, and then third is, I don't know if a union would do much, because the way the sport is structured, it really limits the leverage that a union would have.
So what should come in place instead of a union, do you think? What does it take for fighters to get closer to the athletes from the other major leagues?
I mean, the number one thing missing in mixed martial arts is robust competition. Competition is what drives up wages. I mean, unions are great for, I guess, interchangeable workers. If me and you are working at a factory, a union's great because they could just fire me and put someone else there, replace me instantly. So we all want to band together to make sure we raise our wages. But MMA and athletics are a little different. These are star sports, and the athletes aren't just cogs in the system. They're the attractions. They deserve the majority of the revenue. They deserve, me building an iPhone. The iPhone is the selling point, not me. Me fighting in a cage, the selling point's me. I deserve the majority of the money. So robust competition, I think, would be the biggest. Here's the problem is, fans and even fighters, I don't think are that interested in robust competition. They kind of like the idea of the UFC being a monopoly, being the only show in town where everybody goes. And as long as that's the case, then you can't really force wages to go up, because if people are unwilling or have no interest in watching fighters go to another promotion or fight outside the UFC or any of that, then or even want the UFC to, let's say, not have control over the titles like in boxing. If the fighters and fans insist that the UFC can maintain control, then it's basically impossible to create competition. So that's where I'm kind of pessimistic, because on one hand, the way to increase wages would be to increase competition, but no one wants that. On the other hand, so I guess you have to settle for a union, but a union's not going to accomplish what people want it to accomplish.
What do you think will happen with this situation we have right now, with a lot of UFC fighters being unhappy? Do you think this happened by accident, or like do you think that it was like some kind of momentum, or that something will come out of it?
I mean, if you want to get conspiratorial, I mean, you do have to wonder why, like Masvidal and Jones are both managed by the same management company. So, with the Kawa brothers. So you have to wonder if there's a link there. But I think personally what it is that as more and more information has come out about the UFC's finances, that's kind of triggered the fighters. That before, when it's opaque and they weren't quite clear, they could be happy with what they were getting paid, because they're getting paid more than most people. Getting $1 million or $2 million US is a lot of money for most people. But it's only when you see that, wait a minute, I got $2 million, but you made $25 million. That's when the frustration starts kicking in. That's when the resentment starts kicking in. That money, most of it was because my event made 20 million more than the other guy. I'm the person bringing that money in, not you. Why am I getting such a small slice? So I think that was the main impetus of why this has happened, is that as more and more numbers come out, fighters are getting more and more frustrated with their split.
Fascinating stuff, John. Thank you very much for the interview. You are welcome to Denmark. I know you don't want to come here, but if you do...
I would love to go to Denmark.
If you do, you're more than welcome to Aarhus, which is where I live, in Copenhagen, or wherever you are. Just hit me up and I'll show you around the country.
I'll take you up on that, and you'll be very disappointed that you offered me that offer, because I will take you up on that.
I hope so. Thank you so much, and all the best to you, John.
Thank you. You too.
Det var journalist John Nash fra Bloody Elbow. Tusind tak til ham. Tusind tak, fordi I lyttede med. Vi er tilbage igen næste uge. Samme tid, samme sted. Indtil da, husk, hvis alle sammen kan lide dig, så gør du nok ikke den store forskel alligevel.